of fear, and this is in relation to Kropotkin's antagonism towards religion and his conception of fear, with a dialogue including contemporary authors such as Graeber and Newman. So each speaker will have 20 minutes, and this can be followed by a question and answer session at the end. We encourage the audience to join the video and audio. There should be a request to ask the question yourselves, but feel free to also ask any question in the chat. So I'm now going to invite Christopher and Soren to take it away.
Thank you.
Chris, you're still muted. I don't know if you can hear me, actually. Soren, do you want to...
Chris, can you hear Tom at all?
I didn't hear a single word. I hear everybody else, but I didn't hear a single word of what Mr. Putin
said.
You missed a great introduction.
Is it time for us to start?
It was a great introduction, as Tom said. Yes, it is time for us to start.
All right. Funny, I can hear everybody else. All right. So just give me a quick moment, please. All right. So you can see my screen okay there? All right. If I could have just a quick second. Just a quick moment here, please. All right. I just want to. Okay. Right. Well, that doesn't seem to be working. Right. Sorry about that, people. It's okay. All right. Anyway, I'll figure that out later. All right. So here we go. Put that guy here. Okay. All right. So I'll begin with a little bit of an introduction, Soren, and then you'll take it after that.
Sounds good.
All right. So Soren and I will be talking today, mostly Soren, in fact, about Marie Goldsmith. I'll let him do all of the talking about her and her significance. I just plan on spending about 1 or 2 minutes, no more, linking Goldsmith with Kropotkin. So the connection with Kropotkin is that for 20 years, between 1897 and 1917, and even a little later, but they exchanged over 350 letters between Kropotkin and Marie Goldsmith. And those letters are collected in this book by Michael Cofino. The cover is in French, but pretty much 99.9% of the letters are in Russian. And they always begin with Mój drug, which means my friend, right? And every single one of these letters that included Kropotkin, his family, his wife, and I think his daughter too, Soren can correct me on that, and then members of her family and everyone else in the anarchist community at the time. Thanks to Pascal, who presented just in the previous session, she mentioned this letter. If you want to know what type of connection that they had, they even had discussed collaborating on a new edition of Mutual Aid with Goldsmith's scientific background and her expertise. Soren will get more into that later, but that's in this letter here on the 7th of January, 1910. And you'll find Mutual Aid written there, right there, okay? Where they were discussing that. So quite an honor. I think everybody will agree this is one of Kropotkin's most famous works. The other work that brought Marie Goldsmith into my, that I was introduced to her was Ethics. So Goldsmith translated the first volume of Ethics into French, and it is just incredibly beautifully written. And in the introduction, there was a little part that said that she was working on, she wrote that she was working on the second volume of Ethics. And so then that kind of made me research more about her. And eventually I was put in touch with Soren. But not only we have mutual aid previously, now we have ethics, where Kropotkin really felt, and Maximov stated as well, that he considered Goldsmith the only one really capable of continuing his work scientifically and in spirit, and that also is a huge honor. They discussed scientific and anarchist concepts alongside all kinds of personal things that were happening, different reviews, etc. She translated many of his major works into French, and as I said, ethics is the one that I'm most familiar with, which is quite beautifully done. And when Kropotkin passed, Goldsmith was very instrumental in establishing the Kropotkin Museum. Before we move on to the Goldsmith thing, I just want to take a minute and just really highlight the hard work that Soren has done in all of this. And he is going to be presenting to you, I think, one of the rare, if not only, that I can think of, presentations finally dedicated to this forgotten woman. So, without further ado, Mr. Soren.
Thank you. Thanks for that, Chris. Just by way of a really brief introduction to this whole thing, and I'll talk about the project a bit later. I'm a PhD student in molecular biology, so I have quite a different set of skills than I'm sure a lot of the academics here. But having said that, I've also worked quite a bit in the world of sort of anarchist journalism, and now I've embarked on this historical research project with Chris's enthusiastic help and the support of many other scholars who have voiced support for the project. Some of whom are involved in this very session and also the whole conference. I am looking at Tom at the moment. So thank you for that. And yeah, so without further ado, let's get into Marie Goldsmith, who I am very excited to discuss with all of you. It's worth noting as well that as we go through this, that yeah, every slide could be its own presentation. So I'm going to go quickly through this, and then we can get into details and Q&A, and that'll sort of have to be the way we handle the entire life of an incredibly interesting figure. So despite there's a lot of different birth dates floating around for Marie Goldsmith, but it seems like the quite confident date I can put on her date of birth is in 1871. She was likely born in St. Petersburg to Isidore and Sophia, who were Narodniks, part of the sort of populist movements preceding SRs, which came quite a bit later, and they were pursued by the Tsarist regime, and their sort of persecution, often without evidence, according to at least some of the primary texts that I've looked at from the time, eventually led to Goldsmith's, the Goldsmith family leaving Russia for Europe and for several other countries. Isidore ended up moving to several countries before eventually passing away. But when Marie moved with her mother to Paris, that's pretty much where she settled down and spent most of her life. As she got older, she followed her mother, who had gotten an advanced degree in biology, a PhD, a doctorate, by getting a doctorate herself from the University of Paris in 1894. And it was around that time that she likely met, we don't have a direct confirmation of this, but it's very heavily implied that she met Kropotkin around this time, as well as Solyanovsky and Emma Goldman when they were on their European tours. And from there, they began long correspondences. But the strongest correspondence was definitely with Kropotkin, who she had, as mentioned, 350 letters. So, and that's only up until 1917. There were even more after that. So it was a long and storied relationship. She earned her PhD in biology at the Sorbonne in 1915, which Kropotkin congratulated her on in one of his letters. And she was a very close collaborator with the biologist Yves Delage, who was sort of her scientific mentor, alongside Peter Kropotkin, who was also her sort of anarchist mentor. And tragically, both of them passed within 1 year of each other, around 1920, 1921. And this sort of left her without sort of a guiding light, as it were, at the time. She eventually became a citizen in France by 1924 after a lot of issues with immigration, which I can discuss if folks are interested because it affected her career as a scientist. And finally, she died in an extremely tragic series of events following her mother's death, who she was very, very, very attached to. In 1933, she committed suicide just 2 days later, because she couldn't bear the thought of living without her mother. And on the right, you'll see a photo of Goldsmith as a child from Michael Infino's book. Next. So, as I mentioned, she was a scientist, a biologist. She was very accomplished. It's actually kind of amazing to think how much she accomplished as a scientist. She wrote quite a number of papers. She was the editor of a major journal in biology that Yves Delage managed. And so she was officially, her position was the secretary of the journal, but essentially ran it. She wrote several books with Yves Delage and several after his passing. But even the books she wrote with him are credited to her, really, by people who knew how those books were written, because she was really his protege. And he actually went blind in the early 1900s, and so she ended up being what they refer to her as his eyes. So she was really his sort of gateway into the rest of the academic world by that point, because she was so close with him and so familiar with his ideas. And it's worth noting as well that I think it's really cool if you check this out on Google Scholar, you can see that she's still cited today. I mean, we were finding papers up to 2016, probably more recently even. It's not my field. As I said, I'm a molecular biologist, but in evolutionary psychology and animal behavior, they cite her thesis. It pops up not infrequently, and that's just one of many works that she contributed. So definitely has had a lasting impact. And her books were well known at the time too. I mean, she was reviewed in the New York Times. The Theories of Evolution book was reviewed in the New York Times favorably, and and you can find that online. That's fully translated into English. Some of her other books have not been translated, but I think they are quite interesting and worth pursuing as a historical and also scientific endeavor. Next. So, in addition to her scientific work, of course, she was incredibly involved in the anarchist movement. You can't overstate this point. She was unbelievably prolific, so prolific that, again, it kind of boggles the mind that there hasn't been a full investigation and publication of her work to date in English, considering how much she wrote across many languages. She wrote very frequently for Freie Arbeiterstimme, which is a very famous Yiddish anarchy paper in New York, as well as other Yiddish papers. She contributed to the Forward, for example, very briefly. She wrote for Russian papers, both abroad and in Russia, but especially Russian language papers in Europe and in America. From what we understand, she was also writing in Italian newspapers as well, although I haven't found any direct evidence of that yet, only people discussing the fact that she wrote for Italian publications. She also was a highly valued translator and worked closely with Nestor Makhno and with Peter Kropotkin and others, as well as Peter Lavrov and many other major figures of the time, to translate works from Russian into French and vice versa. And she was highly sought after to not only translate things, but also verify translations that they were accurate. And she also published a number of pamphlets and books, one of which I'll be discussing in just a moment, on her anarchist thought. Yeah, next. So we use the term Titan of Anarchism advisedly, because it's actually a direct quote from Nestor Makhno, who, when eulogizing another anarchist, mentions that she had just passed, but that somebody else was going to do her eulogy. And when he discusses her, Marie Goldsmith alongside, I believe it's Élisée Reclus and Peter Kropotkin. And he describes them all as titans of anarchism. So this is the kind of company that she really was in, according to some of the most prominent anarchists of the time. And I'll also just point out, and I'll talk about this in just a moment, the fact that while she had a good relationship with Nestor Makhno, as far as we can tell, they didn't agree on everything. There were certainly points of heavy disagreement on fundamental anarchist theory, like the platform, but nevertheless, he still held her in this regard after her passing. She was also connected to, this is a very small list of and just covering several anarchists, but there were many more that she was connected to in the scientific and political world, including Georges Clemenceau and many others who she was in direct contact with. But by far, Peter Kropotkin was probably her biggest and most frequent contact. Next. Just to go very briefly over some of her basic beliefs and anarchist sort of ideas. She was absolutely committed to anarcho-syndicalism and to anarcho-communism. She was there's no doubt about her commitment to these two ideas, which she saw as fundamentally compatible. And it's also worth noting that she was highly critical of the revolutionary syndicalist movement that had sort of emerged around Europe at the time. And she talked about this in her book, which, as I say, I'll discuss in slight detail in a couple of slides. But essentially, she was highly critical of syndicalist movements that had sort of erased what she viewed as the fundamental anarchist characteristic of those movements. And it's funny because a lot of the folks that she ends up criticizing went on to become fascists after her death. And so she was actually quite on point with a lot of her criticisms. Some of them didn't, but many of them did go on to either collaborate with the Vichy government or with the fascists in Italy. So it's interesting to see how her criticism sort of played out over history without her knowing, because she died in January 1933. She was deeply, deeply critical of Marxism and Marxists. She rejected Hegelian dialectics. In the Q&A, if anyone would like quotes for these things, I'm happy to pull them up. But essentially, she was absolutely, she rejected this notion that you need to, for example, go back to go forward. That was something she couldn't really understand or she understood but rejected as a means of achieving a goal of communism. She saw communism as the inevitable extension of anarchism, that these two things weren't in any sort of conflict, but in fact, one led to the other, but not Marxist communism. She's specifically just talking about communism as sort of common ownership in the more general sort of Kropotkin sense of the term. She was one of the earliest exposés in Europe of what happened at Kronstadt, where she lays out the hypocrisy, ridiculousness of accusing the Kronstadt sailors of being counter-revolutionaries when just not long before Trotsky had referred to them as some of the most valuable fighters and believers in the revolution, and now somehow they had all turned into counter-revolutionaries. It didn't make any sense to her, so she lays that out in quite compelling and a compelling way in her article, "The Truth About Kronstadt." Yeah, she wrote a lot about the Bolsheviks and how she saw a lot of disillusionment, like Emma Goldman and Berkman and many others, in the outcome of the 1917 election. A lot of lessons to be learned, and she had very little time for the Bolsheviks, who she called social democrats and unserious Marxists relative to their, say, Kautsky counterparts. All right, next. So this is Nestor Makhno on the left, who I'm sure many of you are very familiar with. Just on some of these core ideas that I'll just drill into just very slightly. She was a firm believer in means and ends, like you would hope from an anarchist to believe in this fundamental principle, but she used this as an argument as well to explain why things like the dictatorship of the proletariats are counter to goals of anarchism, why any centralization is again counter to these goals, because what the means don't justify the ends don't justify the means, and that you can't use this kind of logic to achieve the society you want to construct. You always must be doing things, even if it's incremental, in the direction of change. And it's interesting to see that echoed now in things like the PIC abolition movement, where we have abolitionists saying, reform is fine if it moves in the direction of abolition, but not if it re-entrenches those same structures in the current era. And it's a very similar parallel, and that's why there's a lot of overlap between the abolition and anarchist movements. But it's fascinating to read this, almost 100 years ago. and in some cases over 100 years ago. So as I say, she rejected the dictatorship of the proletariat. She was highly engaged in the discussion around the platform, around Machno and Arsenov's platform, and essentially argued that the platform set up too much of a centralized majority rule system. She supported fully the idea of organizing, and that in fact discussed the problems of post-revolutionary Russia, in the sense that anarchists didn't really have a plan for what to do after the revolution, and so the Bolsheviks, the Bolsheviks were able to sort of step in, but she rejected sort of the platform as the answer to that question. She felt it was too much, essentially like a state, like a sort of centralized, democratically run system, as opposed to a federalized system that she supported that was more simplest. And the other thing she was very interested in is ensuring that anarchists of different stripes were. She acknowledged the issues with this, but she also supported the idea of anarchists of different stripes being included in editorial boards, like individualist anarchists or anarchist communists, and so on and so forth. And this was also quite important to her to not be exclusionary on that level. Next. So to briefly get into the project we're working on, essentially our goal was as was sort of alluded to before, through a series of scholarly connections, Chris and I ended up connected with one another, and we decided to work on this project together. And the idea is essentially that we want to publish 3 books. And the first book is Marie Goldsmith in her own words. And so this is a replication of her own book from 1920, Revolutionary Syndicalism and Anarchism, Struggle with Capital and Power, which is a collection of her articles that she compiled and published, and was sort of her main anarchist contribution at the time, though she may have others in her archives that were not yet published in any language, which we are interested to check out, but we haven't had a chance to get into the GARF in Moscow. So that's our first order of business, and we've actually already translated the first chapter with the help of a translator who we're working with, we'll mention at the end. The second book project is Marie in her own words, but curated by us. So these are articles that aren't included in that book, but are essential to understanding Marie Goldsmith's life and her thoughts, especially. And we'd like to compile that along with a foreword and an introduction as well. And so we're quite excited for that. And finally, we are hoping to put together an actual biography of Marie Goldsmith, because at the moment there's very little on her in almost any language. In Russian, there's a bit here and there. The facts aren't always accurate, as I've found. I have, I think, separated straight on a number of issues, but we need to get those sort of together and get them out there, even on something as simple as her date of birth. And so that'll be very interesting to compile and to provide as scholarly work to the community. And finally, we'll just quickly jump through these last 2 slides.
Yeah, we've got about 2 minutes left.
Sure thing, that's perfect. So just as a reaffirmation, we had started this project before we ever saw this, but Alexander Berkman was writing to Molly Steimer, another anarchist living in New York, about the fact that he believed that there should be a fund put together to publish Marie Goldsmith's work. So that was very encouraging to see. And then if you go one more, Gregory Maximoff in his memorial of Marie Goldsmith said the exact same thing. So this is something that's not to our knowledge, never actually happened, but we are very excited to sort of follow through on these ideas. And we're hoping that you know, the community might be able to contribute a bit to this, and that we can collaborate with folks who are interested in this project in the future. To that end, we have our email address here, mariegoldsmithproject@gmail.com. It's quite simple, easy to remember. Feel free to send us an email if you're interested in learning more or discussing, and we'd love to reach out. And just in the acknowledgements, Sarah and Pascal have been really helpful and supportive in the project so far. Alexandra, as I mentioned before, was the translator for the first chapter of the book, and hopefully for the rest of the book as well. Juana has offered her services as a translator as well. And Chris and Ellen have been very helpful in getting funding for this project. And then on the right, we have our funders. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Soren. It sounds absolutely fascinating. I'm sure there's going to be a lot of questions, so we're going to jump straight into Mark. Are you ready?
Yes.
Okay, take it away.
Thank you. The expression in my title, the social physiology of value, is of course used by Kropotkin himself in his Conquest of Bread. Kropotkin uses an expression that has a specific conceptual genesis. There is a debate whether the term value was firstly used in economics and only later did it appear in mathematics and in ethics, or on the contrary, its role in economics is only a late development. Since the so-called neoclassical revolution, the term value is very rarely used in economics. Value is operationalized, it is usually reduced to price, and it is mostly dissolved in the statistical sum of individual preferences. However, in earlier economic theories, value had an important, even central role. Firstly, it was suggested that objects have an immanent substantial value, that is to say, allegedly, it is enough to look at the characteristics of the object in itself in order to determine its value. According to this theory, the object has a valor naturalis, a natural value that can be easily grasped, and accordingly, it is also easy to specify the justum pretium of every object, the just price. This suggests that value has an absolute objective measure. Labor theory of value transformed this simplistic theory into something more complicated, namely it suggests that value, and ultimately the price, expresses labor that was invested into the object. To put it simply, the more we work, the more valuable objects we produce. Almost needless to say, the naivety of both classical value theory and the labor theory of value was severely attacked by neoclassical economists. It is suggested that value theories are naive and wrong insofar as they miss the role of individual preferences and demand. What is interesting is that Kropotkin also strongly criticizes both classical value theory and labor theory of value, but from an entirely different point of view, from an anarchist communist perspective, I would say. Kropotkin claims the following: there can be no exact measure of value, nor of use value with regard to production. Why? Because, as Kropotkin puts it, I quote, "we cannot divide work, otherwise we would disregard all that is complex." Kropotkin argues that there is not even a thought or an invention which is not common property, born of the past and the present. That is, I quote once again, there are no individualist origins for the products of industry, there are no isolated producers. How should we estimate the share of the riches which all contribute to a mass? According to Kropotkin, instead of enforcing division, we should promote the integration of labor that accepts that everything is interconnected. Thus, Kropotkin opposes the measuring of value, also such as it is conceived by labor theory of value. It is not only that value should not be measured, but also that value cannot be measured. This is why Kropotkin opposes anarchist collectivism, that is, the system of labor notes. According to Kropotkin, this is just a new form of wagedom, a pseudo-measuring of essentially incalculable services. As Kropotkin claims, we cannot hold with the collectivists that payment proportionate to the hours of labor rendered by each would be an ideal arrangement or even a step in the right direction. According to Kropotkin's anarchist communism, collectivists promote production and consumption still based on private property. Instead of this paradigm, Kropotkin argues that we should abandon all forms of wages. Workers should not become their own capitalists. Instead, they should radically change the framework of value production. What is interesting is that Kropotkin refers to Karl Marx many times. Kropotkin claims that Marx followed the footsteps of Smith and Ricardo, and he is unsatisfied with Marx's economic theory for other reasons as well. These remarks are somewhat weird, especially the one regarding Marxian value theory, mostly because, in fact, Marx was very critical of both Smith and Ricardo. Check, for instance, his so-called fourth book of Capital, Theories of Surplus Value. It seems that Kropotkin was uncritically repeating certain widespread anarchist phrases. As we all know, there were important tensions between anarchists and Marxists already in this historical period, and also I suppose that Kropotkin has never read Marx carefully enough, perhaps except from the Communist Manifesto, but this is only a hypothesis. Let us also add that some of Marx's works have not yet been published when Kropotkin lived. Why am I telling all this? Because, similarly to Kropotkin, Marx was also criticizing the logic of value production itself. Marx claimed that political economy has never formulated the question, why is labor expressed in value? And, according to Kropotkin, economists, I quote, economists have not solved the question of value. Marx described the self-valorization of value as a spectral mechanism that is essentially absurd. During the valorization of capital, they sell something that is produced by someone else, and also by measuring production in inappropriate ways. At this point, let me quote Michael Heinrich. Marx refers to the term value of labor as an imaginary and irrational expression. Labor, more precisely, abstract labor, is the substance and immanent measure of value. Labor creates value, but does not itself have value. If one speaks of the value of labor and asks how large the value of a workday of 8 hours is, then one would have to answer, the 8-hour workday has a value of 8 hours of labor, a statement that Marx rightly describes as absurd. And let me also quote Peter Houdis, his book entitled Marx's Concept of the Alternative to Capitalism. Value production is inherently irrational insofar as the value of the commodity is not determined by the conscious decisions by the agents of production to leave production relations intact while attempting to eliminate the irrationality of price formation on the market is inherently self-defeating, since it assumes away the very irrationality of value production of which it is the expression. Of course, similarly to Kropotkin, Marx aimed at the abolition of the society in which market relations dominate social relations. In other words, at the abolition of a society in which value separate us from ourselves. As far as labor notes are concerned, Marx criticized earlier socialists, Proudhon and Darimon, for instance, for the very same reasons as Kropotkin did. As Marx puts it in his critique of the quota program, these deductions from the undiminished proceeds of labor are in no way calculable by equity. To sum it up, both Kropotkin and Marx were opposed to the despotism of value. As for prices, Kropotkin spoke of a blind ruler who governs all our social interactions, and Marx was speaking of blinding commodity and of the blinding form of money. Similarly to Kropotkin, Marx also did not believe in a naive substantialist theory of value. Instead, he understood value as something that is constituted within social relations in specific historical circumstances and as changeable factors. They also agreed that common property or the right to labor are not decisive. Instead, we should question the very frameworks of value production. It is fascinating that the so-called communization theory, marked by thinkers like Gilles Dauvé and Bruno Astarian, many journals, and heavily influenced not only by Marx, but by insurrectionist anarchism as well. So-called communization theory also refuses the possibility of truly measuring value. As Dauvé and Astarian put it, no stopwatch expert will ever know the exact average labor time necessary to manufacture any specific object. Communization theory has a very interesting text entitled Communization, written by the editors of the journal Troploin. This text not only describes the Kropotkinian theory as one of the most important visions of a future communist world, but it also praises Kropotkin's mutual aid and Kropotkin's moneyless system of helping oneself to goods that are plentiful and democratic rationed sharing out of goods that are not plentiful. Communization theory aims at shifting to communization, that is, to a complex system in which the logic of value production as such is abolished, according to the maxim, from each according to his ability, to each according to his need. Something similar was argued by another anarchist group, Proletarios Revolutionarios, in their text entitled The Self-Abolition of the Proletariat as the End of the Capitalist World. It is no coincidence that Kropotkin's influence is often very explicit, as he was a sworn enemy of value production. As we all know, there are strong conflicts between Marxists and anarchists. Well, it seems to me that at least in the case of anti-authoritarian Marxism, because I think that such a thing exists, and of obviously anti-authoritarian anarchism, there might be a common ground with special attention to the problem of value production, and Kropotkin might have a decisive role in this dialogue. Within capitalism, almost everything is sacrificed to the abstract self-valorization of capital, including our environment or our workforce. In production, needs are not the priority. Instead, what is decisive is whether something contributes to the multiplication of value. The logic of value determines the process of production in advance. Thus, the imperative of productivism sacrifices the participants of the process of production as well. Almost everything that does not serve self-valorization of value is considered to be a failure, useless, wasted time. Individual capacities and needs are of secondary importance. What is useful because it can be sold at the end of the process of production. Value is the final judge of the essential social processes and relations. So how can we measure labor? It is obvious that the quantity of labor time cannot be decisive. In that case, the labor of lazy and slow workers would be the most valuable. In fact, capital has no proper methods to measure labor in any objective ways. It can only take into consideration the average of socially necessary labor time, but in a speculative way. Value does not have a quasi-physical substance that could be measured by certain means. Thus, ultimately, the abstract relations of value make a decision about performance and products that abstract labor decides about living labor. We can see how absurd is the capitalist system. The abstract logic of value dominates the creation of social wealth, despite the fact that value itself is very obscure and contingent. The merit of Kropotkin was that he understood the importance of this absurdity, given that he was convinced that the existing economic system is bizarre. He was also convinced that political economy gradually emerges from its semi-scientific stage. Instead of an economics that aims at the self-valorization of value, Kropotkin suggested us to study the need of man and the means of satisfying them with the least possible waste of energy by adding that the greatest sum total of well-being and leisure are the supreme aim. This clearly points towards a post-capitalist system. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Mark. If anybody has any questions, they can put it in the chat or ask them in person after we've heard from James. It's all yours, James.
Okay, thank you. Can I get a sound check? Okay, start my timer so I don't prattle on too long. Okay, so what I'm interested in is Kropotkin's abolition of fear, specifically imagining a mystical anarchy after religion. So this is probably the one of the more far out projects of this particular conference. So a fixation of anarchist theory is the specter of power: who has it, who doesn't, and who wields authority and who's subject to authority. Power creates and sustains hierarchical relationships because it establishes a clear asymmetry of authority and subjugation. Yet the reality is that power is built by individuals who choose to wield it and other individuals who comply. Anarchists have long sought to discover the relationships of hierarchical power and then to rupture them. The dethroning of power structures yields an unbundling of carefully constructed systems in which some, like law enforcement, state bureaucrats, religious leaders, and the wealthy, stand to lose. So-called classical anarchist, Kropotkin wrote about power exacted on and by people. Kropotkin traced how states, courts, and churches operated together to mold citizens into compliance. His antagonism towards Christianity and organized religion and its complicity with the state stemmed from a suspicion of power exercised as a mutual insurance company formed by the landlord, the military, the judge, the priest, in order to assure each of them authority over people and the exploitation of their property. With this triumvirate, Kropotkin likewise sought to identify the machinery of coercion, the police, the army, and the guillotine, as well as individuals who chose to uphold these privileges, and the array that gives rise to its turn in a whole system of espionage, of false witness, of spies, threats, and corruption. Kropotkin's antagonism towards power relations has roots in education. The insidiousness of bourgeois education and the making of hierarchies, which then dulled the mind into submission. The apex of such education was not to be caught in such a system of delusion, but rather to believe that it was true. He said, the natural sciences are perverted in order to be placed at the service of the double idol, the church state. The psychology of the individual, and even more of societies, is falsified in each of their assertions to justify the triple alliance of soldier, priest, and judge. The mutual symbiosis of state, courts, and religion were made fully complicit in state-based education as a manipulative blinding exercise to real power. A century after Kropotkin's death, and indeed a century which went on to see unmatched bloodshed, technological advance, and state transformation, violence is imprinted in the name of this triumvirate and solidified in the actions of average citizens. Violence as an outworking of force to maintain systems of control implanted and reinforced in education creates power asymmetries and subjugates people. One of Kropotkin's legacies involves unpeeling the backdrops to modern state power implemented through mutually beneficial institutions. Arguably, Kropotkin's legacy is an ethical challenge because it demands that we consider the role of hierarchical power as we untether the constituent pieces. And here, by power, I mean simply the influence, whether actual or ideological, of, over, and against others. We consider here one of these pieces, religion, with the full argument that it cannot be extracted from the dynamics of state, monetary, and other forms of power. Religion operates within this hierarchical power now as it always has in human civilization. What we dislodge here is the apparatuses of fear, whether through policing, crushing capitalism, or simply capitulation to exploitation. What underpins them all is the power of fear. Such fear is particularly useful in the scope of religious belief, for as one of Kropotkin's modern interpreters, Saul Newman, argues, we're filling the empty space of transcendence, left vacant by the collapse of the theological world. This gap is no mere death of God, but rather a reconfiguration of debt and guilt as highlighted by a number of Kropotkin's interpreters like David Graeber. Fear is the currency which binds together the religio-political reconfiguration. So it's worth asking if this is possible to imagine a future with Kropotkin's abolition of fear. It's nothing new to say that fear motivates people and that religious fear sparks a particular desperation in many people. What I want to untangle here is the mutual threat and promise of fear in the development of religions, particularly in the traditions practiced today. So this concept is called axial religions, which is a highly contested theory, and it suggests that there is a historical anomaly that many of the founders of today's religions lived at roughly the same time. So just to extrapolate a little bit here, this theory says, it's a little bit more than coincidence that the Buddha, Confucius, Jesus, all of the major founders lived within about 500 years of each other. So while there's no evidence that these founders of the major traditions had contact with one another, or knowledge of one another, axial religions are useful when considering the building of civilization and societies. If we can generalize a bit, we can see a common underpinning of fear and violence, specifically of debts which must be repaid. Whether in the Abrahamic, Indian, or Confucian systems, which have different starting points about whether or not humans are fundamentally flawed, each involves a formulaic way to salvation, respectively through being saved by grace and actions of God, the escape from karmic cycles of rebirth, or through the perfectibility of humanness through good governance. At the heart of these systems is an act of exchange, an action, a belief, a compliance, which then enacts an outcome. In other words, an exchange is present. Each of these can be a catalyst for exploitation because they all presume a debt which must be repaid. I want to suggest here that the functionalist view of debt works well in religious claims, but it does not fully work out precisely how they operate with a currency in exchange, which simultaneously binds and deprives people. Graeber does not make too much of a difference between these types of debts. If anything, they mutually reinforce each other. But I argue that there's something deeper going on. Religions extended beyond the borders of financial transactions and other earthly arrangements to make claims on the meaning of life and the possibilities after death. We might call this metaphysics. While religion certainly could have been an impetus to binding communities together, as well as smoothing over mundane everyday transactions, the slippage into metaphysics puts it in a different category than theorists like Graeber acknowledge. Tentatively, if we can acknowledge that religion might operate in a different transactional space, we can also argue that its core method is a perfection of fear. Whereas financial dealings might have consequences for one's family members after death, fear itself is one of the prime motivators of religious belief, because it's a lubricant of deep human anxiety and calls to action in this world. Fear is the currency which binds together axial religions because it serves as the attendant guilt and anxiety to thread together the exchange to repay the ephemeral debt of existence, as Graeber argues, and of the slippage into metaphysics in my line of thinking. The perfection of fear in axial systems stems not from guilt or even anxiety, but from a collapse of religion immanent into religion transcendent. I depart from the classical definitions of immanent and transcendent in their adjectival descriptions of religion, and instead propose a political reorientation. That is, religion immanent, as I'm using it, are the political measures of religion, something akin to a sociological view. It's religion which considers beliefs and viewpoints as mere phenomena, which can then translate into real human activity. It's the line of correlation between what people believe and the actions which they are willing to take in the real world as a result of those beliefs. Religion transcendent, as I'm using it, are the unmeasurable theological claims which may or may not have basis in historical, present, or future realities. It's the metaphysical claims which speak to the ultimates in human life and death. I want to argue that the perfection of fear in axial religion is a conflation of these two ideas. And the way to abolish the fear as the undercarriage is by separating these terms and their political implications. The anarchic practice is to separate the entrenched mutual threat and promise of consequence and reward, thereby rebuking fear. What would it mean to untangle fear from religion? Perhaps what's left is what people are willing to do for the sake of their beliefs. The abolition of fear, it primarily reorients religious motivations. As an example, the 10th century Sufi mystic, Rabia of Basra, might be quite helpful here. Rabia's prayer was to experience God without fear of hell or promise of heaven. Heaven and hell figure heavily in Islamic thought, so the abandonment of both as motivators demonstrates that Rabia sought to transcend fear. This is not to say that Rabia understood belief in heaven or hell, but rather she sought to free herself of the currency of fear. Even in systems which are devoid of theism, the point still stands. Thinking and operating beyond fear recalibrates motivations in the ultimate questions. To untangle fear from religion is to reevaluate motivations. Kropotkin's Abolition of Fear helps us to untangle religion immanent and religion transcendent in their political motivations. For Kropotkin's purposes, mechanized fear in courts, workplaces, and churches produces societal control. In his view, action must be taken so that humanity can and must liberate itself from the fear of punishment, that it can constitute an anarchist society in which the fear of punishment shall disappear. On one level, Kropotkin's notion of punishment is penal. However, his concept of freedom entails closer relations of mutual interest, indicating that the relationship between freedom and punishment have possibly spiritual dimensions too. With a generous reading of economic conditions mapped onto religious ideas, we can see that fear and punishment are used to create identities, from economic destitution to the fear of others if police power were to fall away. Fear and punishment thus create conditions which ordering takes priority. In his Mutual Aid, Kropotkin spells out the irony that some religious movements took the character of a return to the best aspects of mutual aid in early tribal life, yet they can also justify injustice as part of the divine plan. Kropotkin outlines two serious concerns, which in my estimation are quite viable today. Number one, that religion, in his case Christianity, downplays charitable relations to one's neighbors and instead focuses on individualism. And number two, religion makes a people, whereby the very minds of the citizens had been shaped into a new mold. They began to find no authority too extensive, no killing by degrees too cruel, once it was for public safety. In other words, no matter the origination of religion and mutual aid, contemporary religion serves to divide communities and then reshape them into inward-looking, afraid people. A contemporary of Kropotkin, Gustav Landauer, offers an interesting way to think about this problem. Here I wish to explore if there's a way to tie together Landauer's point, but arguably not fully worked out, in his idea of a type of mystical anarchy, as Critchley put it much later, particularly as it relates to Kropotkin's abolition of fear, or a time when humanity can and must liberate itself from the fear of punishment. This is nothing short of a full-scale rejection of a vengeful God in the face of a sublime idea of forgiveness. Landauer proposes a radical reformation of the self through living the chaos, anarchy, to become his own master and the construction of a new world from within. The reconstruction of violence is nothing less than a thoroughgoing rejection of violence in this world and instead an inward violence in the mystical sense in order to be reborn. The process of inward violence and chaos allows people to discover the most authentic and precious inner being, to become one with the world in a mystical union. For Landauer, the violence of anarchism is inward, a mystical abnegation of the self, a rebirth. He is cognizant of the demand and knows not all people are capable of entering into what we might call an ego death through the chaos of inner violence. But for those in whom this is possible, real anarchy rests in the idea that where life begins, systems end. Landauer's thought is influenced by Meister Eckhart, especially in his mystical notions of finding the world within, and particularly in the notion that one can become God, that one can become the world instead of just recognizing it. For Landauer, the path to inward anarchy, or the exposure of the real self, which is where we become infinite, yields community, humanity, and divinity. Landauer's key insight culminates where I try to build myself a new world, knowing that I don't really have any ground to build it on. Rather than a hollow solipsism, Landauer's attempt is to transcend the ego. He says, I accept this world and then surrender my I. I do this so that I feel one with the world in which I had just dissolved. Just like someone who jumps into the water to kill himself, I jump into the world, but instead of death, I find life. The I kills itself so that the world I can live on. The paradoxical sacrifice, the dissolution of the self, becomes the mechanism, the very violence of the world made anew. Landauer's mystical anarchy, then, is an entirely new way of rethinking human community. It's immaterial what the inner divine is, in some ethereal sense, but rather through the violence of rebirth, a new world is forged through the death of the self. What motivations exist for passing through this crucible? To return briefly to Rabia, the Sufi mystic, we can reassess the motivations for attempting a self-dissolution, where Landauer's mystical insight is that individuals can adopt the principles of inner anarchy, the chaos that is used to create divisions in outward daily political life. They too can emerge with the power to transform ourselves in the spirit of the world. Rabia's desire for the immediate presence of the divine, a purified motivation without selfish desire or fear, yields a renewed spirit for this world, as does Landauer's vision for a community rebirth. In both thinkers, religion, at least as understood as a category of typification, melts under the trial of relinquishing fear in the process of rebirth into the world, into a reborn community. Both point beyond religion in this way, through the inner relinquishing of fear, in the dissolution of the self in real presence, in and amongst others, in a real community in which it begins to emerge. This is no simple mutual aid, but rather a reconfiguration of what it means to be human in the presence of others. It is, in a sense, a fulfillment of mutual aid in the making of a new world. Stephen G. recently wrote about the anarchist project of storming heaven and bringing paradise to earth, which effectively mobilizes the religiously inclined and indicts those willing to suspend the fight for this world in hopes of something better hereafter. People not only can, but should storm paradise through boundary transgression to make a better world here and now. It's an uncompromising vision. There's something beautiful in this sentiment of transgression and impatience, and I think that it's the lack of fear. Similar to the prior point about how it's immaterial what their inner divine is, the same is true here. Speculation about heaven is immaterial to the motivation of creating a world modeled after a paradise. This is a religion immanent, not a religion transcendent, but it requires the removal of fear. If we take Kropotkin at his word and re-educate away from violence and fear, and if we take seriously his notions of emancipation, which are beyond a vengeful God and outside the corruption of state and exploitative ordering, might a mystical anarchy show what's after religion? I suspect Kropotkin would wince at the suggestion of reframing techniques of spiritual life, because it could become yet another pivot into an exploitative misadventure. So I'll keep my comments in line with the point about religion eminent. If fear is the currency of religion, and here I'll clarify the currency of religion transcendent, what I want to argue is that the emancipation of fear is the keystone of religion eminent. Here I mean something close to Landauer's conception of the inner divine, which has undergone a painful and violent process of ego dissolution, yet not without Kropotkin's unwielding of the lactations of power relations in society. That means religion immanent adopts the ethos of paradisical living, with living after the mystical dark night of inner chaos and anarchy. Religion stripped of fear plunders hierarchical power structures, which must then be remade horizontal in the painful and risky attempt to live a paradisical life here and now. Under 20 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mark. And I can now invite questions from the audience. I think we've already got one from Cord Casper. Cord, I don't know if you want to come on and ask it yourself. If not, I can read it out.
Oh, yeah.
No, here it is.
Hello, can you hear me? Right, thanks,
Yes,
Mark, and everyone. That was a really fascinating range of insights into Kropotkin's work there. I was just struck by this critique of the immeasurability of value that I mentioned, Mark, and that the fact that it can't be clearly determined. And I was just wondering about those comments that you had at the end, where you talked about different forms of measuring value, maybe post-capitalism. And we had heard a lot today about Kropotkin as kind of positivist, as a believer in kind of versions of modern progress and so on. So I was just wondering whether there is a notion of a more measurable type of value emerging after capitalism that is not as spectral and as, you know, unequal as the forms that he critiques.
Well, I would say then that in this regard, Kropotkin is almost an anti-positivist. So he doesn't suggest that we should measure value in an alternative way, but I would say that we shouldn't have value anymore in a communist society. So for Kropotkin, what is at the center of his theory of post-capitalism are not individual preferences and the sum of individual preferences, but the needs of man with special attention to the basic needs, So housing, food, and so on. These are the basic needs. These have to be satisfied. And besides these basic needs, we have to pay special attention to leisure. So this is the starting point of Kropotkin. And I think that as long as the basic needs are satisfied and there is a way of free exchange in an anarchist society, Kropotkin doesn't need an additional system of measuring value. I don't think that his concept needs it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Cord. I think Dimitri now has a question for Chris and Soren.
Hello. I hope I'm audible. One thing that I wanted to ask was why do you think that a book of Goldsmith's writing has never materialized? I mean, because Maximov has been pretty successful in publishing his own work in the 60s as well, and I don't know, even some of those reprint series which are publishing pretty much anything that they can do in Russia, they haven't touched Goldsmith either, and yeah, so that's the big question. Thank you.
Chris, you can go ahead.
Well, Soren and I have talked about this quite a bit. I'll let Soren say what he thinks about it. I think it's a shame, and I honestly don't have an answer, like a good answer, as to why. She's entirely forgotten, when she was such a significant part of Kropotkin's life. Perhaps the only reason could be is that she did more work in French, Yiddish, and Russian, so wasn't as known to the English people. But in all honesty, I have absolutely positively no idea. Soren, what's your take?
Yeah, I think it's a combination of factors. I think what's most kind of amazing to me is that her contemporaries certainly saw her as a peer, with no hesitation, and perhaps it should be noted her male peers saw her as a peer, and despite this, she's been sort of written out of. I mean, as I say, she's been cited scientifically, but even in science, I mean, I don't know. I'm not intimately familiar with the history curriculum in France, but I don't imagine she pops up very frequently. And so, like, even in like a non-anarchist context, it's kind of surprising to see that she's been sort of erased out. But I think that there's a I think that there is. My feeling is that there are figures like Emma Goldman who were very, well, I'll say two things. Figures like Emma Goldman who were they were firebrands. They got out in front of large crowds and gave gesticulating speeches, and she whipped someone once, and probably more than once. In public, like she was very out there. Marie Goldsmith was very sort of diminutive in her, not in her writing, but in her demeanor, and this is discussed in Maximov's obituary. It's really quite moving and sad that she basically is, saying that they're saying, why are you always so timid when you're in front of an audience? Even though she gave talks all the time in science, anarchism, etc. So that might be part of it. That she just didn't have that sort of public profile in the same way even her close colleagues knew her quite well. And the other thing is, I think, to be honest, misogyny is a major factor. I mean, she's often discussed in the most they undersell her in every capacity constantly. So they'll talk about her as Makhno's secretary, or they'll talk about her as, exclusively with Kropotkin, to understand Kropotkin better, which I know it's part of the point of this conference, but that's exactly the kind of context she gets brought up in, and almost never on her own terms. There's a good article that goes through a little bit of her life that says she's basically only discussed in the context of Kropotkin. She's in Kropotkin's shadow, and I think that that's been sort of her legacy, and it's really strange. And I think Kropotkin wouldn't approve. I think a lot of these folks would approve of this, considering what they said about her and what they entrusted her with after their deaths, or after their and after her death, what people said about her. So I think I think those factors sort of combined. But to be honest with you, I'm not entirely sure. So regardless of what the reason is, we're here to try and rectify that a bit. Hopefully that answers your question.
Thank you.
Thank you. So it's a bit of a mystery, and maybe you and Chris are going to find out why, and you undertake your research. We've got a question from David Saunders. I don't know if you want to come and ask this question yourself, David. You're welcome to request. So just carrying on from that last question, I can't remember Kropotkin ever like name checking Goldsmith in any of his major works or give her any credit? Does that happen?
Sure. I mean, this is a better question for Chris, but absolutely. I mean, she wrote the introduction to ethics. And did you write an introduction to mutual aid as well, or just ethics, Chris?
Yeah, well, she did definitely write the introduction to the French version of ethics, as I mentioned, which is a masterpiece. And as was mentioned later on, I mean, that was I translated that introduction somewhere, which wasn't available anywhere else. So, yeah, she's mentioned there.
Yeah, she's frequently mentioned, and as I say in that as a parallel to that, as I say, Mark knows a eulogy for another anarchist. He openly in the speech is talking about Goldsmith as well. One of the problems I will just say is that she used a pseudonym for almost everything anarchist and used her real name for everything scientific. So she really kept these things very, very separate. And there's only one instance really where those two things intersect, which is a story that we're still trying to piece together from terrorist plots in Paris, but we're still working on piecing that together. Where suddenly her name appears, her real name appears, and I can't imagine what her scientific colleagues must have thought seeing her name pop up in the papers in this context. But aside from that, this was separate. So when people talk about, you have to really look hard to find references to M. Korn and Isidine and Maria Goldsmith. These are all quite different names, but they're all the same person.
So that might be another explanation of why she isn't discussed so much. And we've now got a question from David Saunders to James.
I'm just checking. Can people hear me? Yeah, okay. James, it's a very, very straightforward question. I'm no Kropotkin specialist, but I'm making a little contribution later. And it's about a village that Kropotkin approved of and wrote about, a village of peasants in Western Russian Empire, what would be Belarus today. And I'm going to point out that he makes a lot of this village and writes about it a few times, and he admires the villagers, completely suppressing the fact that, as I think I've demonstrated from archives, these villagers are fantastically committed to their organized religion. He doesn't even speak about it. Well, I can see why you would do that if you're opposed to organized religion yourself. And I mean, that would probably be my own position. I don't share these villagers' Catholicism. But presumably Kropotkin and other anarchists also wanted to attract supporters. So do they have an answer to the question what they're going to do about the fact that ordinary people, the people they want to attract, in the main, at the end of the 19th century and in the early 20th century, were religious. You know, believed in going to church and didn't like it when they were stopped from going to church. That's it.
Yeah, fantastic question. I saw it posted in the Q&A and immediately like, okay. I mean, I think the way that certainly after the so-called, kind of Victorian Revolution, the way that Kropotkin would have thought about Christianity, or anyone for that matter, in the teens and late teens, early 20s, even after World War I, and where we are now, is, I think, totally. I mean, the history of Christianity as it has changed in the 20th century is very difficult to pin. I mean, completely, particularly with state churches being complicit in various different genocides, wars, etc., and having various knowledge of it, things like that. With the specific case study that you're referencing, I'm not entirely familiar with it, but what I can say is that in Kropotkin's writing, when he talks about this, it's always couched within this kind of tight-knit, that it's a piece of the overall complicity. It's a piece of the overall tension that gets people to do certain things, and it's that kind of fear-based, society-based, and it's intertwined with the fear of courts, the fear of landlords, things like this in the church. And in every reference that I have found, it talks about these as being operating together, not separately. So in terms of winning hearts and minds and that sort of thing, my impression of Kropotkin, particularly as it's played out in the 20th century and with some of the more modern interpreters, has been getting people to understand how those things operate together and work very clearly together. I'm not sure that gets at the specifics of your question. I just think that there's a way that they would have viewed the Christian church in 100 years ago, and the way that, particularly in the history of the 20th century, is just utterly different.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Well, thanks. That's a stat. Thank you.
Thank you, David. I think we've got a question from Jason, and then we can go to Sean.
Hi, can you hear me? Okay, cool. Hi, yes, I have a question for James, or rather something I wish to take issue with. I have some trouble with your sort of opposition, firstly, between what you call the axial religions and then mystical anarchism, which you are going along with. My issue is first lumping in the Buddha with the axial religions when you define axial religions as trading in a currency of fear, which if you find in, for instance, the Buddha's teachings in the Pali Canon express a very distinct rejection of the idea of karma as a sort of exchange, a very prominent rejection of accepting truth on the basis of authority, a very extensively developed system for basing one's worldview on self-investigation of experience. And in terms of mutual aid, what's highly prominent in the Buddha's teaching is the idea of compassion, that once one has investigated oneself and seen that there is no such thing as a substantial self, that you can't own property in that sense, and that there's nothing to fear in the sense of retribution, that one should then move to a compassion for every living being. So there you have something that a system of teaching that doesn't fit with what you call axial religions at all, and that is an extensively developed system compared to what you're speaking about in terms of mystical anarchism, which seems quite ambiguous and vague. So I would like to hear a response to that. Thanks.
Awesome. Yeah, and this is kind of the problem with generalizing about a theory which is highly contested. So yeah, I mean, I don't disagree, obviously, that in the early Pali canons that the Buddha is making these points. The Buddha was also extremely dependent on the language, the vocabulary, the philosophy, the metaphysics of Hinduism, which very much operates in this idea that we are trapped in a system of birth and rebirth, and that there's a highly manipulative system with which you have to comply, do things, build karma, etc. And the Buddha does reject a number of those things, but the Buddha also does assume a number of those pieces as being kind of his operational starting point. The Buddha is also very difficult to put into axial religions, particularly in a Confucian or even Jesus or any of the rest of them. And the Buddha, I will acknowledge, it operates in a kind of a separate space as some of these other thinkers. But what I'm looking at too is kind of the basic assumptions, and I think some of the basic assumptions of the Buddha enact a certain assumption about our lives and about what we have to do in order to be freed from those. And that's what I'm trying to get at the root of. I'm not sure. Does that answer you?
But so then I might ask, what you say that certain assumptions that you're trying to get at. What exactly are these assumptions that you're referring to that you find to be contradictory to an anarchist way of life?
Yeah. I'd have to give that more thought on the specifics of it. But in my mind, the problematic area here is that the Buddha is using the same vocabulary and using the same root assumptions about the problem of human life. I don't think that that's necessarily in contradiction to anarchism, but I think it's closer to a more mystical form of it rather than a kind of on the streets version of it.
It's still not clear to me what the root assumptions exactly are that you're referring to here.
Okay.
If you could say more about that.
Yep, that's good. And I've written this down because I think that I very much take your point about clarifying that.
Okay, you two are free to continue to discuss this. I think you can directly message people, but we've got a few more questions, so I'm going to have to move on. Thank you, Jason. Sean, I think... Oh, no. Ole, I'm forgetting about you again. Ole Sandberg, now you can ask your question. You're still muted.
The button. Okay, now I found the button. My question is for Soren. Oh, I don't know if I see you have a Danish Ö, so I assume it's Soren. And it's a bit outside of your presentation. I'm a philosopher, but I'm currently working with biologists on like the concept of life and stuff. And they are mostly phenotype and evolutionary biologists, but I just saw you're a microbiologist, and I'm really curious as to whether you find anything in Kropotkin that can be used in that field, and if so, I'd love to hear about it, maybe in an email.
Well, I'm happy to just very quickly touch on this. It's a bit. So currently I'm working on a degree in molecular biology, but my undergraduate was in microbiology, where we study, small organisms as opposed to small, say, proteins, DNA, that kind of thing. But both apply, so it's all good. But actually, I think it's more applicable to microbiology. So just as a quick point of interest, I think, Kropotkin didn't really have the tools to do this, but so there's this phenomenon that happens in microbiology, which is really cool among bacteria, where they form what are called biofilms, which are these like slimy sort of communities where bacteria of many different species will live and essentially collaborate to form this biofilm, and this is where they live. And in fact, not only do they sort of produce things and sort of work with each other on sort of a chemical level in that sense, they actually communicate with one another through a mechanism called quorum sensing. And this can actually not just happen intraspecies, but also interspecies. So bacteria can talk to each other essentially by excreting these chemicals. And I just think that he would obviously find this fascinating and just further affirmation of many of the ideas you might find in mutual aid. More broadly speaking, and this is going to sound maybe a little bit maybe too general, I think across any scientific discipline, we have a major issue with just not in the practice of science of not engaging in mutual aid and being much more competitive, sort of treating each lab like a little startup that everyone has to sort of hide their data from everyone else and nobody collaborates with anyone, and unless there's sort of an exchange of like a sort of a monetary or credit exchange of like authorship or whatever. And I think that's really dangerous and bad. And I actually think, when you start to expound upon the ideas of mutual aid to the society level, I think the lab is a great example of a place that's not being directed by any government, unless it's a government lab, but mostly they're not, and yet still operate in this very atomized, bizarre fashion. Like, for example, there's no point in helping someone else's project because you won't be lead author on it, so why would you even get involved? And there can only be one kind of situation. It's very toxic. So in that sense, I think that mutual aid has a large role to play. But in terms of biology, like I said, I think biofilms are a really fascinating example of this sort of interspecies cooperation, which goes well beyond what Kropotkin talked about, but I think falls in line, generally speaking, with what he would have found interesting as well.
Thank you.
Yes, that's a great quote. Exactly.
Okay, thank you, Ollie. Now we can move on to Sean.
Hey, can everyone hear me okay? Perfect. I've already written it down, so I'll read it from the chat. I think this followed quite nicely on from our discussion earlier on, where I think Tom asked about mentions of Goldsmith and Kropotkin, and I was just going to ask Mark if Kropotkin acknowledges Marx in any of his work. I've not read much of Kropotkin's work very deeply or very thoroughly, and if not, if there is any evidence that Kropotkin read Marx, as in my experience, he very rarely mentions Marx, but is nearly always quite dismissive and critical in the few mentions that I've seen.
Well, Kropotkin mentions Marx's name in The Conquest of Bread about 4 or 5 times, but always in a critical manner. So he describes Marx as an outdated, bad economist who is not paying enough attention to human needs, for instance. I checked different biographies and monographies about Kropotkin, Brian Morris, Ruth Kinna, and so on, but I wasn't able to find any additional information about the relation between Kropotkin and Marx. This is a little bit weird from a certain perspective because, for instance, they both lived in London, both as intellectuals and as militant activists. So there are certain parallels, obviously, but it seems to me that Kropotkin viewed Marx as a part of a German authoritarian social democracy, something like that. This is my expression, but there is no sign about which works of Marx did he read exactly. This would be very valuable information, but unfortunately I don't have it.
Oh, nice. I think that I might be beating Soren to the punch because he might be saying the same thing I'm about to say. But the only evidence I've seen is that he, in his letters to Marie Goldsmith, he's very critical of Marx, and he even describes a biologist that he really doesn't like as the Karl Marx of biology, just as superficial, making grandissima generalizations on a handful of facts. But maybe Soren can say something else.
Yeah, no, that's a great example. It's a bit difficult to speak to for me because I know a bit about Kropotkin, but not as much as many of the folks here. But I can tell you that Marie Goldsmith references Marx all the time, and also dismissively. But she's directly quoted Engels, also not just Marx, Engels as well, on his own terms. She references, as I say, Hegelian dialectics. So, I mean, she seems to be quite familiar with these texts, and it's not just the Communist Manifesto, although that's discussed. So it goes beyond, I would say, just sort of a cursory understanding. Now, I have no doubt that virtually every Marxist in the universe would take issue with how she is interpreting Marx, as with all anarchists, and I'm sure all those Marxists would find the interpretations of the other Marxists wrong as well. So I don't want to go too far on that, but I do think that that's worth mentioning. And just to answer the question earlier, I didn't answer fully, which is just to say that Kropotkin mentioned Goldsmith, as did many others. They were fully aware of her, and they debated the pages publicly in the pages of various papers on things like the Manifesto of the 16 and things like that. So, and the platform and so on and so forth. So they were all very aware of her and vice versa. So people were very and they formed camps, which were quite distinct as well, in terms of like opposition to the war versus supporting the war. But anyway, yes. So just to say, Goldsmith as well, also very critical of Marx. But it seems to me that she seemed to have a fairly decent understanding. I don't know if she read all 3 volumes of Capital or anything like that, but I think she seemed to understand it to some degree. And in fact, I'll even point out, she was highly critical of anarchists who came to anarchism without having looked at and understood other schools of socialist thought. And she said that, in fact, it's really important that individuals not get sort of sucked into anarchism without sort of understanding why anarchists think what they think, and what that sort of is, what that perspective is in relation to these other socialist schools. But yeah, I think that's worth highlighting.
Right, and I don't know if this session's going to kick us out at 4:30. I've just tried to extend it until 5 o'clock, but if any of the speakers or audience have to leave, you can, or you're welcome to stay. And I'd just like to invite the speakers to, if they have any questions for each other.
So sadly, I do have to leave in about 2 minutes. But anything Goldsmith related, ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Soren is the man to see for that, and incredibly done. Thank you, Soren, for all of that. Yeah, you will be someday, trust me.
Thanks, Chris.
I have to leave, but thank you, Thomas, and to Sean, everybody here, Mark, James, and Soren, and we'll be in touch. Soren, keep it up.
Well, thank you, Chris, for your presentation. I'm sure everybody else thanks you as well. It's fascinating.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. And once we do get kicked out of R4, then if anyone's got more questions, I think you can ask them in the reception area, which I think will still be visible tomorrow or when we log on at any time. But we can wrap up here now, and all that's left to say is we've got 3 panels tomorrow, starting at 10 a.m. That is UK time, and we've got an informal mid-conference discussion at 1 till 1:30, followed by War, Conflict and Revolution at 1:30 till 2:30. I'm going to close the day with one more session at 3 till 4:30 again. And we hopefully see you all there. And thanks for all the speakers, everyone watching, and see you tomorrow.
Thank you.